Hi everyone, and welcome back to the Dark History Podcast, where we delve into the darkest parts of human history. I hope you're all well. I'm Rob, your host as always, and you're listening to Season 5, Episode 13. Last time, we stepped into something grim, something human, just. Tonight, we're going somewhere different, but no less grim. Not even close. Tonight it's about a war. A long one, a brutal one. One that doesn't get talked about nearly enough. Not because it wasn't important, because it's uncomfortable. Because it doesn't fit neatly into the stories we like to tell. This one is the story of a country that did not just lose a war. It lost almost everything. Its army, its cities, its future. In some ways, it lost itself. We're going to South America, to the 19th century, to a small landlocked nation surrounded by larger, stronger neighbours. A place that tried to stand alone, and paid for it in blood. This is the story of the Paraguayan War, and by the end of this, you'll understand why some historians consider it one of the most devastating wars ever fought. Not because of how many died in total, but because of what proportion of the country simply vanished. So, settle in, get close to the fire, because this isn't just a war story. It's a story of a slow, grinding collapse. And of course, it's more dark history. Paraguay did not look like the rest of South America in the early 1800s. If you were to travel across the continent at the time, you'd find countries trying to figure themselves out in real time. Argentina was fractured, pulled in different directions by regional leaders and political factions. Brazil was vast and powerful, still tied to monarchy and deeply connected to world trade. Wars, revolutions, shifting alliances. It was in constant movement, constant instability. But Paraguay went the other way. After gaining independence from Spain in 1811, it did not open itself up to the world. It did not rush for trade, diplomacy, or expansion. Instead, it withdrew. Quietly, deliberately, almost completely. And at the centre of that decision was a man named José Gaspar Rodríguez de Francia. He wasn't a typical revolutionary leader. He wasn't charismatic in the way you might expect, or driven by grand speeches about liberty. Francia was controlled, suspicious, methodical, the kind of man who trusted very little and very few. And once he took power, he reshaped Paraguay in his own image. Borders were sealed, not loosely controlled, sealed. Foreign merchants were turned away or heavily restricted. Travel in and out of the country became difficult, sometimes even impossible. Every correspondence with the outside world was monitored. Paraguay became a place you didn't wander into. Outsiders were seen as threats, not just militarily, but culturally and economically. Francia believed that foreign influence would corrupt the country, destabilize it, open it up to exploitation. So he cut it off. Instead, the country had tightened controls just as firmly. Large estates were broken up. Land was redistributed, often taken from the old elites and handed to small farmers or held by the state. The church, traditionally powerful in Latin America, was brought under state authority. Wealth was flattened, not eliminated, but controlled. There was no real political opposition. There couldn't be. Francia ruled alone, and he ruled absolutely. People who challenged that didn't last long. But here's where it gets interesting. Despite the dictatorship, despite the isolation, Paraguay didn't collapse. It stabilized. While neighbouring countries were dealing with coups, civil war, economic crashes, Paraguay remained steady. Not prosperous in the sense of overflowing wealth, but functional, predictable, self-sufficient in ways others weren't. Food was produced locally. Basic goods were made within the country. There was less reliance on imports, less exposure to global market swings. It was a closed system, but it worked well enough that the people weren't starving in the streets or fighting constant internal wars. Life was controlled, but it was also consistent. And that consistency mattered, because while the rest of the continent was burning through leaders and systems, Paraguay was building something quieter, something more contained. When Francia died in 1840, you might have expected everything to unravel. That's usually what happens when a country built around one man suddenly loses him. But it didn't. Power didn't collapse into chaos. It transitioned. First uncertainly, then more firmly, into the hands of Carlos Antonio López. He didn't abandon Francia's system. He adapted it. Paraguay began to open slightly. Not fully, never fully, but enough to modernize. Industry started to grow more deliberately. Iron foundries were established. Shipyards built along the river. A railway, one of the first in South America, was constructed, not for commerce in the way you'd see elsewhere, but for internal development and control. Education expanded. Administration became more structured, but the core idea remained the same. Control, self-reliance, caution towards the outside world. And then, when Carlos Antonio López died, power passed again. This time to his son, Francisco Solano López. And this is where the tone shifts, because where Francia had been cautious, and Carlos López had been measured, Francisco Solano López was ambitious. He inherited a country that was stable, organized, and usually self-contained. A country that had avoided the chaos that defined much of South America at the time. But he didn't see stability as the goal. He saw it as a foundation. He wanted more. More power, more recognition, more presence on the world stage. He had seen what had existed beyond Paraguay's borders. Modern armies, industrial strength, the scale of European power. And he believed Paraguay could stand alongside it. Not hidden, not isolated, but equal. And that belief, more than anything else, set Paraguay on a path to destruction. López wasn't content with isolation. He had grown up inside of it and understood how it worked, but he didn't see it in the way his predecessors had. Where Francia had seen protection, López saw limitations. Where his father had seen stability, López saw something that could only go so far before it began to hold the country back. And once he came into power, that difference in perspective started to shape everything that followed. As a young man, López had travelled to Europe, officially as a diplomat, but in reality as an observer of power. What he saw there left a lasting impression. This was a continent transforming itself at a pace that would have been difficult to grasp from the outside. Railways stretched across entire countries, connecting cities and allowing armies to move faster than ever before. Factories produced weapons in quantities that made older forms of warfare feel outdated. Armies were no longer loose collections of men, but organized, disciplined forces trained to move and fight as one. But it wasn't just the practicality of it that struck him. It was the image, the presentation of power. Soldiers in identical uniforms, officers trained in formal academies, artillery arranged with precision. Everything about it was deliberate. It sent a message before a single shot was fired. López absorbed it all. Not just the tactics or the technology, but the idea that power had to be visible, that a nation needed to demonstrate its strength if it wanted to be taken seriously. When he returned to Paraguay, that idea stayed with him. He looked at a country he had inherited, stable, controlled and largely self-sufficient, and saw something more than what it was. He saw potential, not just to survive, but to stand alongside the larger nations around it. He didn't want Paraguay to remain hidden behind its borders. He wanted it to be recognized, respected, and if necessary, feared. So he began to reshape it, not by dismantling what had come before, but by building on top of it. The focus shifted towards military strength, and gradually, almost quietly at first, the country began to take on a different character. The army expanded, conscription increased, drawing more men from across the country. Training became more intense, more structured, reflecting the European systems López had observed. Officers were promoted not only for their competency, but for their loyalty, ensuring that the military remained tightly controlled. Foreign advisors were brought in to refine tactics and organisation, adding another layer of professionalism. At the same time, Paraguay began producing more of its own military equipment. Foundries were established to manufacture cannons, ammunition, and tools of war. The country could not rely on imports in the way others could, so it turned inward and built what it needed itself. Along the river, shipyards constructed a small but capable navy, including steam-powered vessels that could patrol and defend key waterways. Infrastructure followed the same logic. Railways were laid down, not primarily for commerce, but to move troops and supplies quickly across strategic areas. Roads were improved where they needed to be, and defensive positions were strengthened along important routes and riverbanks. Everything was designed with movement, control, and readiness in mind. By the early 1860s, Paraguay possessed a military force that was remarkable for a country its size. Estimates suggest that around 60,000 men could be mobilized, a significant proportion of the population. The army was disciplined, organized, and equipped far better than many outsiders would have expected. On paper, it looked like a serious force, one that could stand its ground against larger neighbours, at least in the short term. But that strength came at a cost that wasn't immediately obvious. Paraguay was still a small country, its population was limited, and that meant every soldier mattered in a way that wasn't true for larger nations. Each man in uniform wasn't just a fighter, he was a worker, a provider, part of the structure that kept the country functioning. Losing them wasn't simply a military problem, it was a national one. At first, that wasn't an issue. The army existed largely as a deterrent, a visible sign of strength. But the system López had built depended on one crucial assumption, that it would not be tested beyond its limits. It was designed for a short, decisive conflict, where force could be applied quickly and effectively before losses became too severe. What it was not designed for was a prolonged war of attrition. That kind of war doesn't just measure strength in numbers or discipline, it measures endurance. It demands replacements, resources and time, and Paraguay didn't have that in reserve. This was the weakness at the heart of everything López had created. A powerful military built on top a fragile foundation. It could strike hard, but it could not absorb sustained damage without beginning to break. López either didn't see that, or believed it wouldn't matter. From his perspective, the army he built was enough to deter threats, enough to assert Paraguay's position, and if necessary, enough to win. But when the moment came, when tensions turned into actions, he didn't choose to limit conflict. He didn't test his strength carefully or hold back. He escalated. And in doing so, he set his country on a path where that hidden weakness would be exposed in the worst possible way. Because the army he had built would not be tested against one enemy, it would be tested against 3. And once that happened, there was no version of this story that ended without devastation. The spark that set everything in motion didn't begin inside of Paraguay. It came from Uruguay, a small country caught in a difficult position between 2 much larger and more powerful neighbours, Brazil to the north and Argentina to the south. Uruguay had spent much of its early history struggling to maintain its independence, pulled back and forth between competing influences, its internal politics shaped as much by foreign pressure as it was its own divisions. By the early 1860s, the country was once again in turmoil. 2 main political factions, the Blancos and the Colorados, were locked in a bitter struggle for control. This wasn't just a political disagreement, it was violent, unstable, and deeply entrenched. Each side sought support wherever it could find it, and it meant looking beyond Uruguay's borders. Brazil saw an opportunity. The Brazilian Empire had economic and political interests in the region, and instability in Uruguay threatened those interests. So when the conflict escalated, Brazil intervened, backing the Colorado faction. Brazilian troops moved into Uruguayan territory, officially to protect their interests and restore order, but in reality, it was a clear display of power. It showed that Brazil was willing to step beyond its borders and shape events in neighbouring countries to suit its needs. From Brazil's perspective, this was a regional matter, a way to stabilise a neighbour and protect its own position. But from Paraguay, it looked very different. López watched these events closely. He didn't see a contained conflict. He saw expansion. He saw a powerful neighbour extending its influence and moving closer, asserting control in a way that could eventually threaten Paraguay itself. To him, Uruguay wasn't just a separate country dealing with its own problems. It was a part of a larger balance of power in the region, and that balance, in his view, was beginning to tilt. If Brazil could intervene in Uruguay without consequences, what would stop it from pushing further? What would stop it from turning its attention towards Paraguay next? Whether that fear was justified or not is something historians still debate. But what matters is that López believed it. And belief, in this case, was enough. So he decided to act. In November 1864, Paraguay took a step that turned tensions into open conflict. It seized a Brazilian steamship, the Marquês de Olinda, as it travelled along the Paraguayan River. The ship was carrying the governor of a Brazilian province, along with military supplies. It was a direct challenge, a statement that Paraguay would not stand by while Brazil expanded its reach. Shortly after, López declared war on Brazil. At this stage, the decision was bold, but not yet catastrophic. Paraguay had a strong army relative to its size. It had prepared for conflict, and López likely believed that a swift, decisive campaign could force Brazil to reconsider its actions and negotiate. But that plan depended on speed and positioning. To strike Brazil effectively, Paraguayan forces needed access. They needed to move troops into areas where they could apply pressure quickly. And the most direct route required passing through Argentine territory. So López made a request. He asked Argentina for permission to move his army through its land. Argentina refused. From their perspective, allowing a foreign army to cross their territory was a risk they could not take. It would drag them directly into a conflict they might otherwise avoid. It would compromise their neutrality and potentially put them in the line of fire. So they said no. And that moment, as simple as it might seem, became the turning point. Because López didn't accept it. Instead of backing down or finding another approach, he escalated again. He declared war on Argentina. Just like that, the conflict widened. What had begun as a dispute between Paraguay and Brazil now pulled in a second major power. Paraguay was no longer facing one opponent, it was facing two. And the situation didn't stabilise there. In Uruguay, the conflict reached its own conclusion. With Brazil's support, the Colorado faction took control of the government, and once in power, they aligned themselves with Brazil and Argentina. Now, the lines were clear. Brazil, Argentina, and Uruguay, three nations, each larger and more resource-rich than Paraguay, united against a single opponent. The Triple Alliance was formed. For Paraguay, this was the moment everything shifted. The war was no longer a calculated risk or a limited conflict. It had become something far larger than López had initially set out to fight. What he had likely envisaged as a short, decisive demonstration of strength had turned into a war against a coalition that could outmatch Paraguay in almost every measurable way. Population, industry, resources, and long-term endurance. And yet, despite that, there was no turning back. The decision had already been made. The lines had already been drawn. Paraguay stood alone, and the war that followed would push it far beyond anything it was prepared to endure. At first, Paraguay held its own. Troops moved quickly. Early campaigns saw some success. Territory was taken, and confidence grew. But wars aren't won in opening moves. The Triple Alliance had more men, more resources, more industry, more everything. And slowly, the tide began to turn. A critical moment came at the Battle of Riachuelo in 1865. Paraguay's attempt to cripple Brazil's naval power failed completely. Ships were destroyed, men were drowned, the river became a grave. After that, Paraguay lost control of vital waterways, and without the river, it lost mobility. Without mobility, it lost momentum. And from there, the war became something else entirely. Not fast, not decisive, just long and brutal. By 1866, the war had changed completely. What had begun as a fast-moving conflict, with early advances and the possibility of quick victories, had slowed into something far heavier. The momentum was gone. In its place was a grinding, relentless struggle, where neither side could deliver a decisive blow, but where the costs of continuing rose with every passing day. This is what attrition looks like. Not a single moment of collapse, but a slow wearing down, a steady draining of men, resources, and strength until there's nothing left to give. One of the clearest examples of this shift came at the Battle of Tuyuti in May 1866. It was one of the largest battles ever fought in South America, and it showed in brutal clarity what the war had become. Paraguayan forces launched a massive attack against Allied positions. Tens of thousands of men moved forward across open ground, advancing in formation, following orders that left little room for hesitation. From a distance, it may have looked impressive, disciplined lines pushing forward with purpose. But as they closed the distance, the reality became clear. They were walking into concentrated fire. Artillery opened up first. Shells tore through the advancing ranks, throwing bodies into the air, ripping gaps in formations that were immediately filled by the men behind them. Then came the musket fire, steady, relentless, cutting down soldiers faster than they could move forward. Still, they advanced, because stopping was not an option. Officers drove them forward, and behind that was something deeper. The expectation that retreat simply didn't exist. The belief, reinforced again and again, that they had to keep moving, no matter the cost. And so they did. They crossed ground that quickly became unrecognisable. Grass flattened underfoot, soaked through with blood. The soil churned into a thick, heavy mud, made worse by the weight of 1,000 men and horses moving across it. Bodies lay where they fell, and those still alive were forced to step over them, around them, and sometimes on top of them, just to keep moving. Those who reached the enemy lines often did so, already wounded, exhausted and disorientated. And what followed was close combat, confused, violent and desperate. Bayonets, rifle butts, knives, men fighting at arm's length, slipping in blood, grabbing at anything they could to stay alive for a few more seconds. But most never made it that far. They fell in the open, cut down before they could strike a blow. And when the fighting finally stopped, the field was covered in bodies. Not scattered, but concentrated, thick in places, layered where men had fallen one after another. The wounded lay among them, many unable to move, calling out for help that didn't come, because there weren't enough medics, there weren't enough supplies, there wasn't enough time. The heat made everything worse. Wounds that might have been survivable became fatal within hours. Infection set in quickly. Flies gathered almost immediately, drawn to blood and exposed flesh. The smell began to rise even before the last shots had been fired. A heavy, sickening mix of gunpowder, sweat and the first signs of decay. Some men died slowly, hours, sometimes longer. Thirst, shock, infection taking hold. Others tried to crawl away, dragging broken limbs behind them, leaving trails in the mud that led to nowhere. And through all of this, the reality became harder to ignore. These weren't strategic victories, they were losses. Heavy, irreversible losses that Paraguay could not afford. And yet the pattern continued, because López refused to step back. Retreating meant weakness. It meant giving up, conceding advantage, possibly inviting further pressure. He believed that continuing the fight, continuing to push, was the only way to maintain control in the situation. As the losses mounted, something else began to change. Inside Paraguay, the war didn't just strain resources, it began to strain trust. López grew increasingly suspicious of those around him. Defeats were no longer seen simply as the result of overwhelming opposition or poor conditions. They were seen as signs of betrayal, of weakness, of disloyalty. And once the idea took hold, it spread quickly. Officers were accused of failing in their duties, not through error, but through intentions. Some were arrested, interrogated, and executed. Others disappeared quietly, removed before they could become a problem. Civilians weren't immune either. Anyone who was suspected of dissent, of questioning decisions, of showing hesitation, could be drawn into the net. Entire groups were accused of conspiracy. Networks of supported traitors uncovered, often based on little more than a suspicion or forced confession. One accusation led to another, and under pressure, the people said what they needed to say to survive. Names were given, connections were invented, until the line between the real and the imagined threats disappeared completely. Even Lopez's own family weren't spared. Relatives were accused, arrested, and in some cases, executed. Caught in the same wave of paranoia that was sweeping through the country. What had started as a war against external enemies began to turn inward. Fear became part of daily life. Not just fear of the enemy, but fear of being accused, of being seen as disloyal, of saying the wrong thing at the wrong time. And while all of this was happening, while the armies were being worn down at the front, and the trust was breaking down behind it, the war didn't slow. It continued. Battles were fought. Men were sent forward. Losses accumulated. Because at that point, stopping would have meant admitting that everything up to that moment had been a mistake. And that was something Lopez was not willing to do. So the war carried on, grinding forward, taking more with it, with the passing of time. By the later years of the war, Paraguay was no longer simply losing battles. It was running out of people. Not just trained soldiers or reserves waiting to be called up, but men in the most basic sense. They took the kind of losses that doesn't just weaken an army, but hollows out an entire country. Years of fighting, disease, and starvation had taken their toll, and the numbers were no longer sustainable. Entire generations had been pulled into the war and consumed by it. In many areas, there were simply no adult men left. Villages that had once structure and rhythm, fields worked, families supported, communities held together, were now made up almost entirely of women, children and the elderly. The absence wasn't subtle. It was visible everywhere. Farms left untended, tools abandoned, homes quiet in a way that had nothing to do with peace. And still, the war continued. Lopez had lost the ability to replace what had been taken, but he hadn't lost the will to fight. If anything, that determination had hardened. By this point, surrender wasn't just a military decision, it was personal. To stop would have meant to accept defeat, accepting that everything that had been sacrificed had been for nothing. So instead of stopping, he adapted in the only way he could. He turned to those who remained. Boys. Children were brought into the army, some barely in their teenage years, others younger still. They were given uniforms that hung loosely from their shoulders, weapons that were often too heavy or too complex for them to use properly, and instructions that assumed a level of experience they simply didn't have. There was no real training in the way that there had been earlier in the war. No time for that, and no resources to support it. What they received instead was expectation. The same expectation that had been placed on the men before them. That they would stand, that they would fight, and there would be no retreat. For many of them, there was little choice. With so much already lost, with authority still firmly in place, Refusal wasn't a realistic option, and beyond that, there was something else. Loyalty, pressure, fear, and in some cases, a genuine belief that they were defending what little remained of their country. By 1869, this reality reached its most extreme point at the Battle of Acosta New. On paper, it was another engagement, another attempt to slow the advancing Allied forces. In reality, it was something far more one-sided. Thousands of Paraguayan defenders gathered to face an army that was better equipped, better trained, and still made up of experienced adult soldiers. Among those Paraguayan ranks was large numbers of children, positioned as if they could hold a line that had already been broken many times. When the fighting began, the imbalance became immediately clear. The advance of Allied troops was steady, controlled, supported by artillery and disciplined gunfire. The Paraguayan line responded as it had been taught, firing, advancing, holding position. But the difference in experience and strength showed almost immediately. The children who had never faced combat before were suddenly exposed to it in full reality. The noise, the confusion, the speed at which people fell. Some fired their weapons blindly, others froze, overwhelmed by what happened around them. Many were cut down before they had a chance to react at all. As the line began to break, the situation deteriorated further. At one point, the surrounding grasslands were set alight, whether as a tactical decision to flush out the resistance, or simply as part of the chaos of battle. The results were the same. Fire spread quickly throughout the dry ground. Smoke thickened the air, reducing visibility, and making escape even more difficult. Those caught in it faced a different kind of death. Some tried to run through the flames, emerging burnt and disorientated, only to be shot as they stumbled forward. Others were overtaken by fire itself, unable to escape it in time. The combination of heat, smoke and panic turned what was already a losing fight into something far worse. And still, some continued to fight. Not effectively, not in the way you could change the outcome, but out of instinct, or fear, or the simple refusal to stop while everything around them was collapsing. Small groups held positions long after they should have withdrawn. Individuals continued firing until they were overwhelmed. When it was over, the field was left much like so many others in this war, covered in bodies. But this time, there was a difference that couldn't be ignored. Many of them were children. By the time the war reached its final stages in 1870, Paraguay had been reduced to something barely recognisable. Its cities were damaged or abandoned. Its infrastructure had collapsed. Its population had been cut down to a fraction of what it had once been. Hunger and disease moved through what remained of the country, finishing what the fighting had started. People, weakened by years of hardship, succumbed to illnesses that might once have been survivable. Food shortages became more severe, and survival itself became uncertain. The army, if you could still call it that, existed in fragments. And López, well, he kept going. He retreated further inland, taking with him what little remained of his forces. There was no longer any realistic path to victory, but that no longer seemed to matter. The war had moved beyond strategy. It had become something else entirely, something driven by refusal rather than possibility. In March 1870, it finally came to an end. López was located near Cerro Cora, deep in the interior. He was already wounded, weakened by the same conditions that had affected everyone else. Lack of food, constant movement, exhaustion. He was surrounded, outnumbered with no real means of escape. He was given the chance to surrender. He refused. Accounts of his final moments vary in detail, but the outcome is consistent. He was shot, and then finished off where he fell. His reported final words, "I die with my country," have been repeated often. Not because they're dramatic, but because they reflect the reality of what had happened. At that point, there was very little of Paraguay left to separate from him, because in many ways the country had already been destroyed long before that final moment. What remained was simply what hadn't yet had time to disappear. Thank you for taking the time out of your day to listen to this long and dark episode. I'm not going to waffle on too much, but the Paraguayan War isn't widely remembered, but it should be. Not because of its scale, but because of what it represents. A country pushed to the point where survival stopped being a goal, and endurance took its place, where the line between defence and destruction disappeared completely. What stayed with me the most wasn't just the numbers, it was how it ended. Not with surrender, not with a clear conclusion, but with a slow collapse until there was almost nothing left to collapse. And of course the elephant in the room, the children. That's the part that doesn't leave you. Because when a country is sending children to fight, it's already over. It just hasn't admitted it yet. Even now, Paraguay still carries the aftermath in its population, its history, its identity. Some events don't fade, they embed themselves. This is one of them. Anyway, before we go, if this episode stayed with you, it would mean a lot if you left a rating or a review wherever you listen. It really helps more people find the show. And if you know someone who'd be gripped by this kind of history, please share the episode with them. If you want to support the show more directly, you can find all of our links to our socials, our merch store, and our Patreon in the show notes or description below. Our Patreon members get every episode completely ad-free, which is a great way to dive even deeper. Picking up a t-shirt or a mug from the store helps keep the lights on. All of this is optional, but deeply appreciated. If you haven't hit subscribe yet, please do. It's the best way to make sure you never miss a story. Your support is what lets us keep digging into these dark corners. Thank you always for that. So with all that out of the way, don't forget, if you're looking for another strange story to dive into, check out Dark's Travelling Emporium. Thank you again for listening. Join us next time for our next episode as we delve into another event and more dark history.